Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or good evening. My name is Tom Langen. I'm reaching you from upstate New York State, and I'm going to share with you some work that I've been doing with my graduate student Imanthi Abirathna, and formerly with a colleague in Spain, Victor Colino, who is now at the University of Salamanca. And we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, the effective daylight savings time and clock shifts on deer vehicle collision rates, and more generally about the timing of deer vehicle accidents. As we all know, wildlife vehicle accidents are one of a principal focuses of managing wildlife and roads. And ungulates are one of the most important groups of animals for damaging deer vehicle accidents. So if we look, I can manage the technology. Here's some data mapped from New York State. Each of those dots is a deer vehicle accident that occurred between 2005 and 2007. You can see it's over the entire state, except a few large roadless areas that we have. So there's 86,000 collisions here. We average about 26,000 deer vehicle collisions per year in New York State. Those are the ones that are recorded in terms of police records. For every one that's in a police record, there's thought to be perhaps one that's not. Overall in the US, vehicle damage averages about $2,600 simply for the damage to the vehicle. And if we include things like the 26,000 deer vehicle accidents in the US that result in severe injury, 200 or more deaths per year from these accidents, and other costs, they average over $6,000 per accident. So what we can see is a substantial economic cost and a toll on people and a huge animal welfare problem. Here's some data that I've graphed showing deer vehicle accidents in New York State in 2007, from January to January. And what you can see is very clearly that there's some patterns. So early in the year, it's relatively low. During the spring, there is a peak during June and July. Then again, it drops. And then starting in the fall, September and October, it climbs rapidly to a peak in late October and November, far higher than earlier, and then it drops off over time in through January. And so we can see a very high period, one high period of accidents, a second smaller one, and a couple of lows. A lot of variation. These variations correspond with all kinds of things like day of the week and other factors. When we've looked at the timing of when these accidents occurred, these 86,000 accidents, here we have data for white-tailed deer, our database, plus 3 species in Europe. And what we find is if we look at the rate of wildlife vehicle accidents per hour, and this is deer vehicle accidents, it's far higher at dusk than it is at any other time of day. Here's dusk, here's dawn, here's at night, and here's during daylight hours. So your highest risk per hour, the highest volume of number of accidents, the rate of accidents, is at dusk. If we look, however, overall in terms of hours, because night and day have more hours than dusk than dawn, then we find that most accidents occur at night, and actually secondly during the day, and then at dusk and dawn. And this is simply because the dusk and dawn period is relatively brief and intense period of accidents, longer, lower frequency, lower rate of accidents at other times. Now, one of the things that we looked at was the phase of the moon. We suppose that the phase of the moon drives some animal behavior, and so that this might have an effect on deer vehicle accident rates. So here we have new moon, first quarter, full moon, and last quarter. And we can see that deer vehicle accidents peak during the full moon. It's about 25% higher than during the new moon. And here we have this pattern over a year, and we find that that full moon pattern happens throughout the year. Other data that we have indicate that deer travel farther and probably are more likely to encounter roads during the full moon. It's also true that most accidents occur during the full moon or during any moon phase when the moon is brightest. So accidents happen when the moon is brightest. We also find little evidence that the reason for this is differences in driver behavior during a full moon. So daylight savings clock shifts. Spring forward, fall back. We know that in the US and many states, we have a shift in the clock time, which results in fall, sunset occurring an hour earlier, sunrise occurring an hour earlier. In spring, sunset happening an hour later, sunrise happening an hour later. Now, this happens in over 70 countries. We have some kind of daylight savings clock shift. So it's a very common practice, particularly in temperate countries. It disrupts circadian rhythms, causes sleep disruption and fatigue. So indeed, it's fairly controversial about the benefits of daylight savings clock shifts when we have in comparison to these sort of negative effects. They result in temporary increases in accidents and injuries after the clock shift. These accidents and elevated injuries occur for about 5 days, the week immediately after a clock shift. There's also some evidence of temporary increases in motor vehicle accidents during the week after a clock shift in some places. So we thought about it and came up with several hypotheses of what we might find if we look at these data. Of course, first is that there's no effect. If we look at the daylight savings time shift, that there's no change in accident rates. But alternatively, and more interestingly, possibly driver fatigue. And if that's the case, we would expect that the accident rate would jump after the daylight savings clock shift, and then will drop over time, probably over the time course of a week, and then return back to a baseline. Alternatively, there's a traffic flow shift. So traffic flow, peak traffic volumes are shifted by an hour with that daylight savings, and that might result in a permanent or a long-lasting increase in your vehicle accidents, or indeed, depending on how it occurs, it might result in a long-lasting reduction, but certainly a long-lasting or persisting change. The third possibility is it affects deer phenology. That is that deer phenology are responsible for a trend that we see associated with daylight savings. And what I mean by that is that it may be that deer activity levels are changing across the period, which coincides with the time shift. And for example, in this case, deer vehicle accident rates are increasing over time for other reasons involved with deer, for example, mating season. And it just happens to be that the time shift happens in the midst of those. In that case, if we compare before and after, it looks like the daylight savings time is having an effect, but that's just a correlation and not causation in this case. So we've looked at the data, and here's DVC, deer vehicle collisions, across the spring and fall time shift. Spring time shift, there's really very little difference. It turns out there's actually a slight drop in that first week, but it's pretty minor. In the fall, we can see that there's increasing deer vehicle accident rates going up in the 4 weeks before the shift, and in the 4 weeks after it remains elevated. About the 4th week it declines. So we see a trend, and this trend corresponds with a natural phenological trend in these deer. In other words, in this case, the mating season is going to a peak of movements during rut, which coincides with the time shift. And so we see this elevated rate in part because of those reasons. Now we looked further and looked at weekday versus weekend, and we find that looking at Sundays and Tuesdays is typical of weekdays and weekends. And we see that on Sundays, there's little change, maybe a slight decline the week after daylight savings. Similarly, on Tuesday. In the fall, here's our increasing pattern due to phenology, and then a jump on Sundays On Tuesdays, we don't see it as much, although it turns out that we look at each day of the week, we do find that there's a bit of an increase after versus before. But it becomes more evident when we look more carefully. So in these figures, we show the 24 hours of the day, before and after, in the week before and the week after, for spring and fall. The arrows indicate sunrise and sunset. The black bars indicate the peak rush hour in the morning and evening peak rush hour during the work week. And these data correspond to the work week. What we find the spring here is before and after. And after, there's a slight increase, a slight increase in the evening and decrease in the morning. Really not much of a difference, no effect for all intents and purposes. However, in the fall, here is before and here is after. And what you see is a big jump in deer vehicle accidents after the time shift relative to the fall in the evening after sunset, which corresponds with the evening rush hour occurring more into that dusk, that dangerous dusk period. So the clock shift in the fall shifts peak evening work week transit into the period of the highest rate of deer vehicle accidents. So when do these occur? To summarize, deer vehicle peak at the deer rut, which coincides with the fall shift. The fall clock shift increases, deer vehicle collisions, particularly on weekday evenings with commuters returning from work or other after work activities. Now you have to always be careful. Deer vehicle collisions occur almost anywhere at any time, but be especially careful on dusk and bright full moon nights in fall, and be aware that that time shift in fall is likely to put you as a driver at that period of high risk. It also leads us to consider whether we should be reconsidering the value of daylight savings clock shifts. Thank you very much.